In 1396, you are a priest standing in Westminster Abbey's chilly stone corridors. As you grip your prayer book and stare in awe as staff bustle about getting ready for what the courtiersrummer will be the most extraordinary royal wedding England has ever seen, your breath mingles in the fall air. The bride, a princess who is reportedly the daughter of King Charles himself, has come from France. In your lifetime, you have performed several marriage blessings and linked innumerable hands in holy matrimony, but you have never witnessed such a commotion at court. Your eyes enlarge in shock as the wedding party arrives through the enormous oak doors, with his golden hair gleaming in the filtered light coming through the stained glass windows. The 29-year-old groom, King Richard II, makes a striking impression. A Celd-like figure is walking next to him, her small hand barely reaching his elbow, completely engulfed by his gloved palm. This little princess, in her ornate French gown, with her dark hair braided with pearls that appear too heavy for her tiny head, can only be 6 or 7 years old. You lean on the altar rail for support. This is the new English Queen, Isabella of Valois. You've witnessed brides as young as 12 or 13 in your lifetime. 4 noble families, political matches were the norm. You are aware of the times you live in, after all. Life is short and unpredictable. 50 years ago, half of the population was wiped out by the Great Disease. Marriages bind treaties more firmly than any scroll or seal, and kings must form alliances. While they may, you observe the child's face as the ceremony starts. She appears less scared and more intrigued. The soaring Gothic arches, the flickering lights, the aristocrats in their finest silks and velvets, and the grandeur all around her were all reflected in her huge, dark eyes. King Richard's voice is soft, even protective, as he makes his vows. Taking a young bride for selfish reasons is not a monster's behavior. By using this most sacred tie to secure peace with France, this monarch is carrying out his duty to his realm. There will be no consummation of the marriage. Everyone knows this. Until she reaches adulthood, the young queen will be brought up and educated at the English court. It is the standard procedure. Even if your heart is racing as you declare them husband and wife, you bless their union with a firm voice. As you watch this young child ascend to the throne of England, you can't help but worry about what fate has in store for her in the perilous realm of royal politics. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. I think it's amazing that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past, despite time and location. Isabella Valois and Richard II's union was never intended to be romantic. A human chess piece was moved across the board to end the 100 Years' War, one of the most horrific wars in European history. It was a masterwork of medieval diplomacy. We must first comprehend Isabella's birth environment and the circumstances that shaped her short, tragic life in order to comprehend her fate. The eldest daughter of one of the most turbulent kings in medieval Europe, Isabella was born on November 9, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris. The young princess may have experienced some frightening moments as a result of her father, King Charles V of France, having episodes of insanity, known to history as Charles the Mad. Her father's illness would occasionally turn him from a capable leader into a deranged madman who occasionally lost his sense of self, refused to take a bath for months at a time, or thought he was made of glass. Imagine Isabella's early years at the lavish yet precarious French court. Her father may one day bounce her on his knee while lavishing her with affection and presence. The next time, she may find him standing still for hours, certain that his glass body would break into 1,000 pieces if he moved, or cowering in a corner, screaming that assassins were coming to kill him. During these times, the children would be hurried away by the royal maids, but young Isabella's eyes were filled with perplexity and anxiety. Isabel of Bavaria, her mother, was a strong woman who worked to keep the kingdom together when her husband was unable to do so. Isabel, who was smart and beautiful, had her own political aspirations and was more aware than most that her children were important resources in the intricate web of European politics. With strategic eyes, she observed her oldest daughter, Isabel, who would eventually acquire a vital French alliance because of her beauty and royal ancestry. Isabella was born into an almost perpetually war-torn world. England and France had been embroiled in a bloody war that had ravaged both kingdoms for almost 60 years. Because of English claims to the French crown, the 100 Years' War had started. However, it had developed into something far more intricate. Generations have been consumed by the fight for territorial domination, economic supremacy, and national identity. English raids left French communities in ruins across the Channel. English aristocrats had made their fortunes funding campaigns. Both kingdoms were worn out, their people tired of conflict, and their treasuries empty. In both courts of peace, there were rumors by the 1390s, but it took more than words to bring about peace. It required bonds that were difficult to break. Isabella, at 6 years old, entered the grand theater of European politics at this point. In 1395, during confidential talks between French and English ambassadors, the notion of Isabella's marriage to Richard II initially surfaced. The loss of his cherished first wife, Anne of Bohemia, the year before, had crushed Richard. The English loved Anne for her kindness and generosity, and she was known as Good Queen Anne. Not only was Richard devastated by her plague death, but he also had no heir, which was a risky circumstance for any medieval king. Richard's advisors advised him to get married again as soon as possible, but the English king first objected. Unlike many royal relationships, his marriage to Anne had been one of sincere affection, although it seemed like a violation of her memory to replace her loyalty to the realm eventually triumphed over sentimentality. Richard also started to pay attention when French representatives showed up with a proposal that would put an end to the conflict. The extent of the French proposal was bold. In addition to offering the king's eldest daughter's hand in marriage, they also offered an enormous dowry of 800,000 francs, which would significantly help replenish England's war-torn treasury. More significantly, they proposed a 28-year pause, which would allow a whole generation to grow up without experiencing conflict. There was one major problem. In medieval times, Isabella was just 6 years old. This was a royal bride who was abnormally young. Girls who were at least close to adolescence were involved in the majority of political marriages. The French negotiators, however, contended that this very youth was a benefit. The union would represent a fresh start, free from the animosity and violence that had defined the two kingdoms' interactions. Growing up at the English court, Isabella would pick up English traditions and allegiances. She would be equally French and English by the time she was old enough to rule as queen consort. There was disagreement among Richard's advisers. The plan was deemed wise by some. The royal household would be sustained for years on end by alone, and the prolonged truce would free England to concentrate on other dangers, especially Scotland's increasing influence and the continuous uprisings in Ireland. Others were concerned that it would scandalize even the medieval nobility to marry a child at such a young age, setting a precedent. Richard, however, was fascinated by something else. His frown softened, according to court onlookers, when he viewed the small painting of Isabella that the French embassy had sent. This child would require care, protection, and direction. Maybe, someone said, the childless king saw in this arrangement not just a politicalliance but the opportunity to be a father as well as a husband. Ambassadors routinely crossed the canal to iron out the finer points throughout the months-long negotiation. Isabella's future life was discussed and planned out in detail. She would keep her ladies-in-waiting and French maids. She would be permitted to communicate with her relatives and follow French traditions. Most importantly, the compact expressly stated that the marriage would not be consummated until she attained physical maturity, as agreed upon by both parties. Isabella, age 6, was playing with her dolls in Paris while her fate was being decided. In council chambers and recorded in paperwork that was bound with ribbon and wax. She started learning English phrases from her tutors, while seamstresses began working on a queen-sized truss. Across the lake, she was informed that she would wed a renowned king. At 6, however, the idea didn't seem any more genuine to her than the bedtime fairy tales her nurses told her. The fact that the wedding ceremony was held twice illustrates how diplomatically delicate the union is. On October 31st, 1396, Isabella married Richard II at the English-controlled port of Calais when she was just 7 years old. Negotiators and senior nobles from both kingdoms were the main attendees of this initial private event. Calais served as neutral ground for this momentous occasion because it was an English territory on French soil. Isabella must have felt overwhelmed by the seriousness of the situation as she stood in Calais Castle's great hall. She needed assistance walking because her gold gown was so heavily embroidered and adorned with pearls. Witnesses observed that when she appeared scared by the gathered nobles' gaze on her, her new husband gently raised her chin while he knelt down to exchange rings. She was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey a year later. Several individuals are said to have perished in the crush to see the well-known young bride. Large groups of people traveled to London for the coronation because they were curious about the new child queen whom the English had heard about. The actual wedding was a magnificent exhibition of royal spectacle intended to demonstrate to the English nobility and outside observers that the crown fully supported this unique union. Isabella flirtatiously represented the union of the two kingdoms by passing through the streets of London in a litter adorned with English and French roses. English duchesses who had been selected to act as her guardians and tutors carried her train, and she wore a crown that had been specifically crafted for her little head. She was only starting to grasp the English used by the crowds lining the streets to scream out blessings, but she waved and smiled as she had been taught. Jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical productions illustrating the great future this union would bring to both realms were among the entertainment options at the 3-day coronation feast that followed. As nobles toasted the young queen's health, Isabella sat at the high table next to Richard, picking at her food with the meticulous graces her French instructors had instilled in her. However, seasoned courtiers were already starting to question how long this peace would remain as the festivities went on. Despite their intricate negotiation, medievalities were brittle structures. Despite his current position of authority, Richard II's nobility did not all love him. Although England's military position remained strong, there were rumors of dissatisfaction, especially among those who believed the king was too swayed by his favorites and too eager to make peace with France. But Isabella was safe in her new home for the time being. She was placed in her own quarters at Westminster Palace by Richard, who had a carefully selected household that included both English and French servants. Her days were devoted to teaching her the intricate manners of English court life, in addition to languages and courtly achievements. She was taught to curtsy in the English way, to eat with wine instead of ale, and to speak English with the court accent instead of her French teachers. Richard himself actively participated in her welfare and education. According to modern accounts, he would frequently visit her chambers and bring her presents from all across his realm, including rare birds from Ireland, exquisite literature from Oxford, and musical instruments made by the finest craftsmen in London. She started to look forward to his visits, greeting him with the mix of formality and affection that characterized their unique relationship. Since he seemed to actually enjoy her company, Isabella was promptly adopted as one of the court's children. In medieval royal homes, the monarch's personal family was usually raised and educated alongside a large number of young aristocrats. The daughters of Richard's allies, who were about her own age, were especially friendly to Isabella and assisted her in navigating the nuances of English noble society's unwritten conventions and complex hierarchies. The daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers, Margaret Holland, was her favorite friend. The young queen thought Margaret was sophisticated and worldly, even though she was only 2 years older than Isabella. Isabella learnt English children's games from Margaret, who also helped her figure out which women in waiting were trustworthy with secrets, and alerted her to the political undertones that even young children couldn't completely avoid. While Margaret described the lineages of English aristocratic houses and the old feuds that still simmered beneath the surface of court etiquette. The two girls would spend hours in Isabella's private garden, honing their needlework. Isabella picked things up quickly, and her French viewpoint on English politics frequently shocked her more senior friends. "Why do the English nobles seem to watch each other so carefully?" Isabella once asked Margaret. "Everyone seems to be waiting for something to happen here, whereas in France there are groups and arguments." Almost from the start, Richard's rule had been characterized by disputes with his nobles. Margaret, who was smart beyond her years, explained he had never fully forgiven those who had opposed him, and there had been a significant revolt when he was a child. Many of the great lords, meanwhile, thought Richard was too fond of his court favorites and too ready to disregard their counsel on issues of government and war. Margaret stated that although the monarch is now powerful, the nobles in England must also share power. Although your marriage benefits him by bringing about peace with France, some believe it demonstrates his weakness and his preference for dialogue over victory. With the seriousness of a kid who was only starting to realize that her life was influenced by powers far greater than herself, Isabella took these lessons to heart. She started to observe court relations from a different perspective, noting how some nobles would become quiet when Richard walked in, how conversations would change when she showed up, and how even her French ladies-in-waiting seemed to be selective about what they said while discussing politics. For Isabella, 1397 and 1398 were quiet years. From a small child, she developed into a more self-assured young woman, her knowledge of court life becoming more complex and her English becoming fluent. She started to feel truly at home in England as Richard continued to show her paternal kindness. Westminster's enormous stone walls grew recognizable rather than frightening, and she was able to find her way around the intricate network of hallways and rooms without getting lost. Her education went beyond the traditional feminine achievements of music and needlework. Some of the best scholars in the realm were her tutors, and Richard insisted that she learn to read and write in both French and English. She learnt about the great people whose deeds had built the society she now lived in by studying history, especially the chronicles of English and French kings. Maps were used in one of her favorite classes. Her study chamber's floor was covered with large parchments that her tutor, Master William, a learnt clerk, would spread out to demonstrate to her the size of both kingdoms and explain how geography had shaped centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel next to these maps and use her finger to trace the coastlines, picturing the ships that transported embassies and soldiers across the channel. Master William would reply, "See here, Your Grace," indicating the slender waterways that separate Cala and Dover between our peoples. This narrow body of water has served as a bridge and a barrier. Your marriage is a symbol of the hope that it will ultimately simply be a bridge. Even at the age of 8, Isabella understood that she represented something greater than herself, and nodded gravely. She was more than a young woman becoming a queen. She represented peace between two countries that had been at odds for as long as anybody could remember. But in the bloody realm of medieval politics, as Isabella was about to discover, symbols could be delicate objects. Isabella saw changes in the court's environment in early 1399, which was the first indication that trouble was coming. When she appeared, the conversation ceased even more abruptly. When they believed she was not looking, her women in waiting exchanged anxious looks. Even Margaret Holland, who made an effort to keep to their regular schedule, was preoccupied and nervous. Richard himself seems to have changed. He stopped visiting Isabella's apartments as often as he used to, and when he did, he seemed distracted, occasionally gazing out the windows towards the Thames as though he was expecting to spot ships approaching. Isabella started to question whether she had offended him in any way when he stopped giving her the books and trinkets he always gave. It was a child's infraction, but the truth was much more terrible. Richard's youthful queen had nothing to do with the biggest dilemma he had ever faced. Richard had banished his cousin Henry Boling, broke the year before, and he had returned to England with an army, pretending to have come solely to retrieve his inheritance, but with much more in mind. The English nobility, many of whom had been dissatisfied with Richard's leadership for a long time, started to support Henry with frightening rapidity. The carefully crafted stability that had given Isabella a sense of security at the English court was disintegrating. When Isabella woke up one morning to discover that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had vanished throughout the night, she became acutely aware of the gravity of the issue. She got vague responses from her French attendants when she inquired about their whereabouts. When she peeked out in the afternoon, she saw armed men in strange attire, and she could hear shouting coming from the courtyard under her windows. That night, Margaret Holland, her face white with terror, rushed into Isabella's rooms. "You have to pack right away," she said in a desperate voice. "Only the most important items. Tonight, we're heading out of Westminster." "Where are we heading?" Isabella inquired, her pulse pounding with a panic she hadn't experienced since arriving in England. Margaret answered, "To the Tower." Isabella grasped the King's statement. The Tower of London served as a jail and a palace. Furthermore, the distinction frequently lost its significance during periods of political unrest. The trip through the shadowy alleys of London was unlike anything Isabella had ever experienced. They traveled in a tiny, tightly guarded convoy, with armed men riding in front of and behind her litter, rather than the ceremonial processions she was used to. She could hear the sounds of the city surrounding them, even though the curtains were drawn, not the normal clamor of business and everyday existence, but something more pressing and dangerous. Isabella was placed in cozy apartments in the Tower, but it was obvious that the flats were made to contain their occupants rather than just house them. Guards were stationed at each entrance, and the windows were barred. The majority of her English attendants were fired, but her French women in waiting were permitted to stay with her. Isabella felt genuinely alone for the first time since she had come to England. When Richard visited her on her second day in the Tower, he was a startlingly different person. A man who appeared to have aged years in a matter of weeks had taken the place of the self-assured, gentle king she had known. His hair was messy, his clothing was rumpled, and there was a wildness in his gaze that made Isabella uneasy and reminded her of her father's fits of craziness. He knelt before her chair and said, "My dear child," just as he had done when they first met, "I'm afraid things have gotten tough for us. Some people want to destroy the harmony we have established with your father's realm and contest my authority to reign." Isabella, who is now 9 years old and much more mature than she was 3 years ago, recognized the ramifications. She questioned bluntly, "Are you still king?" For the time being, Richard's smile was bitter. "Because Henry Bowling lost a lot of fans, and I might not be able to shield you as well as I used to." They had never had a talk like the one that followed. For the first time, Richard addressed Isabella as a political equal who needed to comprehend the facts of her predicament, rather than as a child in need of protection. He clarified that many of the great nobles had turned their backs on Richard's cause, that Henry was vying for the throne, and that the future of England and the peace with France now depended on it. "What will happen to me?" With a poise that would have been impressive for any adult, much less a 9-year-old kid, Isabella inquired. Richard said, "I don't know," and Isabella could see how this doubt plagued him. "Henry might try to use you as leverage with your father, or he might respect our union and keep you safe. Whether he prioritizes peace with France over his personal goals will determine a lot." Isabella learnt the harsh maths of medieval politics for the first time in her life. From this, her significance as a diplomatic asset and a symbol outweighed her personal worth. Even while Richard had truly loved and cared for her, it was insufficient to protect her from the more powerful forces that were changing the English realm. The weeks that followed were filled with excruciating uncertainty. Beyond the walls of the tower, Isabella could hear the sounds of the city, but she had no access to trustworthy news about what was going on. Even the French ladies, who spoke to each other in their own tongue, seemed to know little more than gossip and conjecture. Isabella finally heard the sound she had been dreading, the heavy footfall of armed men approaching her chambers on a gray October morning. When the doors opened, she noticed said freshman dressed in Henry Bolingbroke's red rose livery instead of the guards she had grown accustomed to. A towering, commanding man with the demeanor of a soldier and the strategic eyes of a politician stepped in behind them. This was Henry V of England, who had come to meet the youngster, who was both a challenge and a chance for his future rule. As she had been instructed to do when she met a monarch, Isabella got up from her seat and gave a deep curtsy. Henry looked at her for a long time, observing her elegance, her obvious knowledge, and maybe figuring out how he could use her. He addressed her formally as Your Grace, and Isabella saw that he continued to use her regal title. I regret that circumstances have made it necessary to discuss your future under such conditions. What has become of the king? Isabella inquired, addressing Richard with the candor that had come to define her. Henry retorted, Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king, referring to Richard by his given name instead of his title. In support of my claim to the throne, he has abdicated. Isabella didn't question the euphemism, but she was politically aware enough to realize that abdicating probably meant being forced to cede the throne. Rather, she posed the issue that would have the biggest impact on her immediate future. What happens to me? Isabella's status as queen, or as a very valued prisoner, would depend on Henry's response. The new king's judgment on whether to uphold the peace deal with France or risk war for other political reasons would determine her fate. That depends on a lot of factors, Henry remarked. My counselor Sadis, your father's reaction to the recent occurrences, and perhaps most importantly, your own behavior in the months ahead. Isabella, then 9 years old, started the most perilous chapter of her life with those remarks. The harsh realities of a country in transition had replaced the sheltering bubble of Richard's court. She was no longer only a young queen being brought up to carry out her regal responsibilities. She was a political prisoner whose worth could be compared to the price of peace or war. For Isabella, the weeks after Richard's deposition were a survival masterclass. She had to negotiate the perilous waters of a court that was still debating what to do with her after being confined to the tower but not yet officially imprisoned. She should be sent back to France right away, according to some of Henry's allies, to save money on keeping her household and to show that England was prepared to renegotiate the peace pact from a stronger position. Others advised caution, pointing out that England would have more negotiating power with France in the future because of Isabella's presence. Her father would be unwilling to do anything that would jeopardize her welfare as long as she was in English custody. According to this group, she needs to be kept comfortable but closely monitored. For a little child, Isabella herself performed her role with amazing skill. She was always kind to her new prisoners, taking care to avoid offending them or giving the impression that she was planning an attack on Henry's regime. She refused to be treated any less than the queen she was legally entitled to, while yet retaining the dignity that came with her position. During this time, her French women-in-waiting were crucial. These women were loyal to Isabella's interests, not to any English faction, unlike her English attendants who had been fired or had run away. They guided her in the delicate balance she needed to maintain and assisted her in understanding the subtleties of her circumstances. Madame Ducy told her to keep in mind her principal woman-in-waiting. In the eyes of your father's court and the law, you remain Queen of England. Even though Henry is the king, he hasn't had the courage to openly disavow the treaty or end your marriage yet. You are valuable as long as that is the case, and hope exists where worth exists. But Isabella was only just starting to realize the dreadful price of her hope. News of Richard's tragedy started to circulate across the Tower. Rumors first circulated that he had perished at Pontefract Castle while being held captive. Subsequently, there were rumors that the former king's death was not natural and that his followers had orchestrated an accident. Isabella was taken aback by the news when she was finally told that Richard had passed away. Richard was not someone she had ever loved the way a wife loves her husband when she was still a child. How could she? He was the closest thing to a father figure she had known since leaving France, though when he had shown her kindness and protection. His death represented not just personal loss, but the severing of her last connection to the life she had built in England. The manner of Richard's death also carried ominous implications for her own future. If Henry was willing to arrange the murder of an anointed king, what scruples would he have about disposing of a French princess who had outlived her usefulness? These fears provided when in early 1400, Isabella received an ultimatum from Henry's government. She would be allowed to return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as the rightful King of England and renounced any claims she might have to the English throne as Richard's widow. The proposed agreement was a diplomatic masterpiece from Henry's perspective. By voluntarily leaving England, Isabella would implicitly accept that her marriage to Richard had been dissolved by his deposition. This would free Henry from the obligations of the original peace treaty, while avoiding the political complications of forcibly expelling a child queen. For Isabella, the choice was stark. Accept exile, and acknowledge that her 3 years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse and risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. At 10 years old, she was being asked to make a decision that would affect not only her own future, but also the relationship between England and France for years to come. Her French advisors were divided. Some argued that she should accept the terms and return to the safety of her father's court, where she could be cared for properly and perhaps eventually find a new marriage. Others insisted that she should refuse, maintaining that she remained Richard's legitimate widow and England's rightful queen, regardless of Henry's emancipation. Isabella herself struggled with the decision for weeks. Part of her longed to return to France, to see her family again and escape the uncertain atmosphere of Henry's court. But another part of her recognized that accepting Henry's terms would be a betrayal of Richard's memory and an abandonment of the peace he had died trying to preserve. In the end, the decision was made for her by events beyond her control. Charles Vi, during one of his lucid periods, sent word that he expected his daughter to return to France immediately. The message delivered through diplomatic channels made it clear that continued negotiations over Isabella's status would be interpreted as an act of hostility by the French crown. Faced with the prospect of renewed war with France, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The terms of her release were kept deliberately vague, allowing both sides to interpret her return as either voluntary or forced, depending on their political needs. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was a bittersweet experience for Isabella. She was leaving behind the only home she had known for 5 years, abandoning the apartments where she had learnt to read English poetry, the gardens where she had played with Margaret Holland, and the great hall where she had been crowned Queen of England. At the same time, she was returning to a family and a country that had become foreign to her during her years in England. She now spoke French with a slight English accent, preferred English fashions to French ones, and had to relearn the etiquette of her father's court. The little girl, who had left Paris at 6, was returning as a young woman of 11, shaped by experiences that none of her French relatives could fully understand. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's deteriorating mental condition. Charles V was in the midst of one of his worst episodes when Isabella arrived, convinced that he was being pursued by invisible enemies and refusing to recognize his own family. When he finally emerged from his madness several weeks later, he seemed confused by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten that she had been married to the English king. Her mother, Isabel, was more welcoming, but also more calculating. The Queen of France immediately began considering how Isabella's unique position might be used to advance French interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella had a certain diplomatic status that could prove valuable in future negotiations. More immediately, her experience at the English court made her a valuable source of intelligence about English politics and military capabilities. Isabella found herself caught between these competing demands on her loyalty and knowledge. She was French by birth and had returned to French soil, but she had also been Queen of England and felt some lingering obligation to the country that had been her home. When her mother's advisers questioned her about English dances or Henry's support among the nobility, she answered carefully, providing general information while avoiding details that might be used to plan military campaigns. The months following her return to France were a period of adjustment and reflection for Isabella. She was no longer a child, but she was not yet fully adult. At 11, she had already experienced more political upheaval and personal loss than most people encountered in a lifetime. The question now was what role she would play in the complex world of medieval European politics. Her status as a former Queen of England made her an attractive marriage prospect for various European nobles, but it also complicated any potential matches. Some potential suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political significance. Others were more interested in the political advantages of marrying her than in Isabella herself. Isabella, for her part, had developed strong opinions about marriage based on her experiences with Richard. She had seen how political marriages could provide protection and stability, but she had also witnessed how quickly such arrangements could collapse when circumstances changed. Any future husband would need to understand that she was not simply a diplomatic cassette, but a young woman with her own intelligence, preferences, and ambitions. The French court of 1401 was a dangerous place for someone with Isabella's complex loyalties. The ongoing war with England meant that anti-English sentiment ran high among the nobility, and Isabella's years as Queen of England made some courtiers view her with suspicion. She had to be careful not to appear too sympathetic to English interests, while also not betraying the genuine affection she had felt for Richard and some of his supporters. At the same time, her father's mental instability meant that the French government was effectively controlled by competing factions of nobles, each seeking to advance their own interests. Isabella had to navigate these factional disputes while avoiding being used as a pawn by any particular group. Her mother, Isabeau, proved to be both a protector and a potential threat. The Queen of France genuinely cared for Isabella's welfare, but she was also a sophisticated political operator who saw her daughter's experiences and connections as valuable resources for the crown. Isabeau's protection came with expectations that Isabella would serve French interests, even when those interests conflicted with her own preferences or moral convictions. The year 1402 brought new complications when Isabella received word that Henry Eve was facing serious rebellions in England. The Percy family, once his supporters, had turned against him, and there were uprisings in Wales and Scotland as well. Some at the French court argued that this was an opportunity to invade England and restore the rightful dynasty, possibly with Isabella playing a symbolic role as the legitimizing widow of the last Plantagenet king. Isabella found herself horrified by these discussions. She had no desire to see England torn apart by civil war. Regardless of her feelings about Henry's emancipation, the English people she had known, her servants, her tutors, her childhood companions, were innocent of the political crimes committed by their rulers. The idea of French armies ravaging English villages in her name was deeply disturbing to her. When directly asked for her opinion about potential military action against England, Isabella chose her words carefully. She pointed out that any invasion would likely result in massive casualties on both sides, that the English people might rally to defend their homeland regardless of their feelings about Henry, and that success was far from guaranteed given England's natural defenses and military traditions. Her reluctance to support anti-English action earned her some criticism from French hawks who accused her of divided loyalties, but Isabella's position was supported by more moderate voices at court who argued that peaceful relations with England served French interests better than renewed warfare. These political tensions came to a head in 1403 when Isabella was approached by representatives of Charles, Duke Orleans, with a marriage proposal that would dramatically change her life once again. The Duke of Orleans was Isabella's cousin, the son of her father's brother, and one of the most powerful nobles in France. At 29, he was exactly the same age Richard had been when he married Isabella, but this time the age gap seemed less significant. Given that Isabella was now approaching 14, the proposed marriage was attractive from several perspectives. It would keep Isabella within the French royal family, preventing her from becoming a diplomatic asset for some foreign power. It would also align her with one of the most cultured and sophisticated courts in Europe, as the Duke of Orleans was known. As a patron of arts and literature, as well as a capable military commander for Isabella personally, the match offered the prospect of a marriage based on mutual respect rather than pure political calculation. She had met her cousin several times during her childhood, and he had always treated her with courtesy and kindness. More importantly, he was old enough and experienced enough to be a true partner rather than simply another guardian figure. The negotiations for this marriage took place against the backdrop of continuing chaos in England and growing French confidence that Henry's reign might not survive its early challenges. If Henry fell, there was always the possibility that Isabella might be recalled to England to legitimize a new regime. This potential complication made the timing of Isabella's remarriage crucial from a French perspective. Charles Orleans understood the delicate nature of the situation. This added a layer of complexity to their courtship that was unusual, even by the standards of medieval noble marriages. When Isabella first met with Charles to discuss the marriage seriously, she was struck by how different he was from Richard. Where Richard had been gentle and somewhat otherworldly, Charles was passionate and intensely engaged with the world around him. He spoke to her not as a child to be protected, but as an equal whose opinions and experiences mattered. "I want you to understand," he told her during one of their private conversations, "that I am not seeking to marry the former queen, even want to wed Isabella of Valois, the extraordinary young lady who made it through to kingdom's courts without losing her honor." Isabella was really drawn to Charles in a way that had never happened to her before. She was no longer a child at 14, and the emotions that were arising inside of her were those of a young woman coming to terms with her own preferences and desires. Charles was smart, sophisticated, and attractive, but more significantly, he appeared to regard her as a person and not just a political tool. After both parties agreed on the fundamental terms, the marriage discussions moved quickly forward. Charles would give Isabella a stable place in French society and shield her from anyone who would want to take advantage of her for their own ends, while Isabella would bring her position as a former queen and her important political ties to the union. The ceremony, which was held on the 14th of June 1406 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, was a purposeful contrast to Isabella's first marriage, which had been a minor diplomatic affair with Richard. The purpose of this spectacular festival was to showcase the wealth and influence of the French royal family. Isabella, who is now 16, had her black hair topped with a sarclet of pearls and sapphires, and was dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that was flirtatiously embroidered with gold. She confidently made her way down the aisle of the magnificent cathedral. She was now a young lady pursuing her own goals, not the terrified child who had been wedded to an unknown guy. In his finest robes, Charles waited for her at the altar, his expression not one of diplomatic satisfaction, but one of true joy. Their voices were powerful and clear when they exchanged vows, and spectators saw that they stared at one another. Instead of just reciting words to meet political requirements, the ensuing wedding feast was a celebration of French strength and culture. Troubadors honored the pair with melodies. The best wines from all across the realm were freely available, and elaborate theater productions portrayed the victory of love over hardship in a manner she had never been able to accomplish while in England. Isabella found herself unwinding and taking pleasure in the celebrations. More significantly, she felt like she belonged someplace for the first time since she left France. As a young girl, she was welcomed back by the French court as a useful member of the royal family who had learnt from her experiences and grown wiser. rather than as a failed political experiment. Isabella had some of the happiest years of her life during the first few years of her marriage to Charles. In addition to being a loving spouse, Charles was also a thoughtful friend who appreciated the same books, music, and other forms of art that she did. Poets, academics, and painters from all across Europe came to his court at Blaye, which developed into a hub of cultural sophistication. Isabella enthusiastically jumped into a new role. She kept in touch with academics across Europe, supported Rubers, and commissioned illuminated manuscripts, and set up a scriptorium where monks copied and preserved significant literature. She promoted intellectual contact between French and foreign courts by using her unique viewpoint on European culture, which she had gained from her experiences in England. Additionally, she started to find her own political voice. More significantly, Charles regarded her judgment on a wide range of matters impacting their duchy and the kingdom at large, and he appreciated her insights into English events. Isabella discovered that she was no longer only a decorative consort, but rather a real partner in administration. In 1407, Yin, a daughter, was born as the couple's first child. Isabella pursued parenting with the same fervor she applied to all other endeavors. In the midst of her father's chaos, she was determined to be a more present parent than her own mother had been. Despite the objections of court physicians who believed this to be beneath the dignity of a duchess, she insisted on nursing the infant herself. Isabella experienced a deep sense of fulfillment as she held her daughter for the first time. Without the political intrigue that had influenced Isabella's own upbringing, whispering in French and English to the sleeping baby, she promised that Jean would have options that Isabella had never had. Isabella and Charles grew closer after the birth of their daughter. Despite the pressures of his military and political duties, he showed himself to be a loving parent by spending time with Jean as he read to their baby or just watched her sleep. Isabella frequently found him in the nursery, marveling at the miracle of this new life they had produced together. Despite Isabella's domestic bliss, the outside world persisted in interfering. The rising tension inside France itself posed a greater threat right away, as different aristocratic groups were keen to fill the power void left by the king's mental sickness. Of these lords, Louis of Orleans, Isabella's father-in-law, was one of the most aspirational. He asserted his right to rule during Charles V's infirmity, since he was the king's brother. The Duke of Burgundy, however, who had his own followers and his own ideas about the future of France, refuted this assertion. Ultimately, France would be torn apart by the conflict between the Burgundian and Orleans groups. However, it appeared to be just another of the political controversies that surrounded the royal court in the early years of Isabella's marriage. By concentrating on her family and her cultural interests, and letting others handle the political wrangling, Isabella attempted to remain above these factional disputes. When agents of the Duke of Burgundy killed Louis of Orleans in the streets of Paris in November 1407, this cozy neutrality was no longer viable. The murder was committed with startling audacity. Before vanishing into the tangle of medieval Parisian alleys, the assassins killed the king's brother in broad daylight. Overnight, the assassination changed Isabella's life. Charles was a marked man, but he was also one of the most powerful men in France. Having inherited his father's titles and duties, The Olan family was now the Duke of Burgundy's main target, because he had shown that he was prepared to use violence against his adversaries. Her correspondence was tracked to make sure that no information about her family's activities ended up in the hands of the enemy, and her travels were restricted for security reasons. The somber reality of civil war took the place of the joyful ambience of their court at BL. The murder of his father changed Charles himself. The sophisticated, creative young man Isabella had married started to exhibit a more aggressive side, motivated by a need for retribution that occasionally alarmed her. In preparation for what everyone knew would be a protracted and brutal battle with the Burgundian faction, he started to assemble allies and resources. Isabella was concerned about the cost of the impending war, but she backed her husband's cause. She feared that France might experience the same tragedy that had befallen England during the Wars of the Roses, having already witnessed the devastation of lives and kingdoms caused by political bloodshed. As the battle between the Orleans and Burgundian groups turned into open warfare, her worries turned out to be foretelling. The political tensions temporarily subsided in 1408 when Isabella gave birth to her second child, a son named Charles. The Orleans family's claim to future French power was reinforced by the birth of a male heir, but Isabella's family became even more appealing to their adversaries. Isabella took much more care with her son's upbringing than she did with John. In addition to making sure Charles would grow up knowing the rights and obligations that came with his noble heritage, she also wanted him to acquire the kind of character that would enable him to successfully negotiate the perilous realm of medieval politics without sacrificing his humanity. From choosing tutors to creating his curriculum, she insisted on being engaged in every facet of his education. She made sure her son studied the histories of several European kingdoms, acquired a variety of languages, and honed the diplomatic abilities that would be crucial to his future position by drawing on her own experiences at the English court. Both sides were eventually worn down by the series of battles and sieges that characterized the early years of the Civil War. While Charles was out on a campaign, Isabella was left in charge of the family's domains, a role that required her to become an expert in the intricate mechanics of medieval governance and warfare, using her organizational skills to make sure that supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's army when they were required, as well as her diplomatic abilities to maintain alliances. She demonstrated a surprising level of proficiency in these jobs. During this time, she had fully accepted her role as a political leader, as seen by her letters, a grown lady taking charge of her own life rather than the bewildered youngster who had been moved between courts. France suffered greatly as a result of the war. Competing armies destroyed entire districts. The common people suffered from the depravities of soldiers on both sides, and trade was hampered. By creating philanthropic institutions and securing safe passage for refugees escaping the brunt of the war, Isabella made use of her position to help where she could. Her popularity in France grew as a result of her efforts to aid the war victims. In addition to becoming the Duchess of Orleans, she gained notoriety as a kind leader who never forgot her duties to the general populace. As the political climate in France grew increasingly complex in the years that followed, this reputation would prove to be beneficial. It was a cause of both happiness and worry when Isabella's third child, a daughter named Margarita, was born in 1409. At the age of 20, Isabella's health was suffering as a result of her numerous pregnancies. Isabella was wise enough to comprehend the dangers she faced with every childbirth, even though medieval medicine provided little insight into maternal mortality. She took extra precautions during her pregnancy, seeking the counsel of the top doctors in the area and drafting comprehensive instructions for her children's care in the event that she passed away. These measures paid off, as Isabella almost lost her life due to complications during the birth of Margaret. Isabella teetered on the edge of death for a few days following the birth. Her body was weakened by infection and blood loss. Throughout Europe, emissaries were dispatched to pray for her recovery, and Charles hardly ever left her bedside. Isabella and Charles were forced to face the brittleness of their happiness and the uncertain future their children faced when they realized she might not live. Isabella recovered gradually, but not fully. Her health had been harmed by the birth in ways that would persist throughout her life, making her vulnerable to the many diseases that afflicted medieval societies. Her doctors warned her more promptly that she would probably die from another pregnancy. She received advice that had a significant impact on her relationship with Charles. The fear of pregnancy took precedence over the couple's physical intimacy, which became cautious and limited. Both of them struggled with this shift in their relationship, but Isabella in particular struggled because she had enjoyed their love's physical manifestation. After discovering her own desires, the passionate young woman was now compelled to repress them in order to survive. Isabella and Charles's marriage held firm in spite of these difficulties. By concentrating on their common political and cultural interests, they discovered fresh ways to communicate their love and cooperation. Isabella took a more active role in the administration of their lands, essentially acting as Charles's co-ruler. During his anti-Burgundian War, when the Duke of Burgundy started negotiating with the English in 1410, in an attempt to get Henry IV to support the Burgundian side in the French Civil War, fresh obstacles arose. Isabella was appalled at the idea of English intervention because she thought France would experience the same destruction that had marked the 100 Years' War. Isabella opened back channels of contact with the English court by taking advantage of her special status as a previous Queen of England. She tried to convince Henry IV through middlemen that getting involved in the French Civil War would be expensive and ultimately pointless. The fact that she was still regarded with mistrust by many in England hindered her efforts, but she continued to try to stop the two kingdoms from engaging in large-scale combat. These diplomatic initiatives demonstrated Isabella's increasing political acumen. She realized that her worth came from more than simply her royal ties. It also came from her ability to recognize broader trends in European politics and develop multifaceted plans. Her reputation, both in France and beyond, was improved by the accomplishments of her diplomatic endeavors. She started to be consulted on more general issues of French policy as well as issues pertaining to her husband's lands because of her distinct experiences and proven ability to handle challenging political situations. Her comments were taken seriously. Isabella's condition worsened in 1411 and 1412. Margaret's birth injuries had made her susceptible to respiratory infections, and her persistent exhaustion made it harder for her to perform everyday tasks. Perhaps realizing her time was running out, she started to devote more time to prayer and reflection. Isabella maintained her mental acuity and emotional involvement with her family and obligations in spite of her physical limitations. She persisted in managing the family's political affairs, supervising her children's education, and pursuing her cultural interests. Those around her were inspired by her will to live life to the fullest in spite of her physical issues. There was a fleeting glimmer of hope in the spring of 1409 when the Uhlan and Burgundian groups started preliminary peace talks. Isabella was a key player in these talks, bridging the divide between the two sides with her reputation for impartiality and her diplomatic abilities. Despite the negotiations' eventual failure, Isabella's efforts received widespread recognition and improved her reputation as a possible mediator in such disputes in the future. Her political maturity and dedication to finding peaceful solutions to France's issues were evidenced by her ability to collaborate with members from both sides. As 1409 went on, Isabella's health started to deteriorate more significantly. She developed the wasting disease that would ultimately take her life, and the long-term respiratory issues that had dogged her since Margaret's birth grew worse. Although medieval doctors could tell that she was in serious health, they were unaware of the TB that was probably killing her. Isabella approached death with the same bravery she had displayed throughout her life. She carefully considered the future of her children, making sure they would be safe and educated no matter what happened to her. Knowing that her death may open doors for their adversaries, she also sought to strengthen the political prestige of her husband's group, preparing for death and savoring the time she had left with her family occupied her final months. For as long as possible, she insisted on carrying on with her regular activities. Her resilience in the face of terminal sickness became legendary, generating stories and songs that would be sung for decades to come. She was determined not to become a burden to people she loved. At the age of 20, Isabella of Valois passed away on September 13, 409. She had lived through 2 marriages and 3 kingdoms, experiencing both the peaks and valleys of political unpredictability and royal power. In addition to her family and subjects, the many people whose lives she had impacted with her knowledge and generosity also mourned her passing throughout Europe. One of the biggest funeral homes in medieval France transported Isabella's remains to the Celestine convent in Paris, where they were eventually interred. European delegates gathered to honor a woman who had personified the nuanced interplay between individual bravery and political need that defined her era. The loss of his wife grieved Charles of Orleans. In addition to losing a cherished spouse, he also lost a political ally and trusted advisor whose advice had been essential to his success. Even though the grieving widower would eventually get married again, he would never forget Isabella or the joy they had experienced together in their little time together. The children of Isabella went on to play important parts in the history of France and Europe. Her daughters would marry well, bolstering the Orleans family's standing, and her son Charles would go on to become a renowned poet and patron of the arts. They all upheld the morals that their mother had taught them: bravery, empathy, and a dedication to utilizing their advantages for the benefit of others. The death of Isabella had political repercussions both inside and outside of France. Her absence caused the Civil War to lose a moderating influence, making the rivalry between the Orlandan and Burgundian groups even more acrimonious and destructive. France would suffer from internal divides for years to come, and the peace she had fought so hard to attain remained elusive. But Isabella's influence went far beyond the short-term political fallout from her passing. She had shown that a determined individual could make room for autonomous action and moral leadership, even at a time when women were supposed to be passive political assets. Other ladies dealing with same issues found encouragement in her life experience. Later generations of female monarchs and political players who aimed to push the limits of what was deemed feasible for women in public life pointed to Isabella's bravery and brilliance as an example. Isabella's story has occasionally been difficult for contemporary historians to comprehend. Caught between disapproval of the events that shaped her life and pride for her own accomplishments, a 6-year-old child marrying a 29-year-old guy goes against modern views on consent and childhood. Even when we comprehend the political imperatives that led to these agreements, however, to evaluate Isabella's world based on contemporary norms would be to overlook the story's deep humanity. A system that viewed royal offspring as diplomatic assets was in place when she was born. However, she was able to overcome those constraints and design a life that was truly fulfilling and meaningful. Regardless of their beginnings, her marriages developed into partnerships founded on affection and respect for one another. Her time was characterized by political unrest and bloodshed, not because of moral failings, but rather because of a society in which governmental legitimacy and personal safety were continuously disputed. The persistent human capacity for moral courage and progress is demonstrated by Isabella's ability to overcome these obstacles while upholding her integrity and compassion. Her tale serves as a reminder that history is about more than just the great army movements and the emergence and collapse of kingdoms. It is also about the unique people who experienced these events and molded them by their decisions. By making the decision to be more than a victim of her circumstances, Isabella of Vore left behind a legacy that goes beyond the particular political structures of her era. Looking back across the ages, Isabella's life demonstrates both the constraints and the opportunities that have always defined human life. Despite being limited by the expectations of her age and gender, she managed to exercise her agency and contribute significantly to the world. In the end, her tale is one of tenacity, intelligence, and the refusal to acknowledge the incompatibility of political duty and personal fulfillment. We can hardly fathom how cruel and brutal the medieval environment that gave rise to Isabella of Valois was. Childhood was short, life was short, and human lives were frequently used to solidify political connections. Nevertheless, despite these limitations, individuals like Isabella managed to find methods to express love, create beauty, and form connections that gave their lives purpose. Instead of being a victim, her legacy is one of overcoming adversity that would have broken a weaker person. Ultimately, Isabella's tale serves as a reminder that moral complexity varies with age, and that, despite the apparent differences between their worlds, people from the past shared our basic human wants for security, love, and meaning. To comprehend her life is to comprehend a fundamental aspect of the human experience, that although we are all products of our era, we are all able to overcome the constraints placed on us by time. Thank you for joining Secret Historian on this extraordinary journey into the warnings left behind by those who vanished. If you believe, the past still holds wisdom. If you know deep down that history was never asleep on Lee, waiting, subscribe now to Secret Historian.